Hi, this is David Anderson of Lean Kanban. You're listening to the Agile Uprising podcast.
On the 8th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me
8 maids a milking, 7 swans a swimming,
6 laying geese,
5 golden rings,
4 calling byads,
3 French hens, 2 turtle doves,
and a partridge in a pear tree.
Welcome to 12 Days of Agile. I am the Texan, Chris Merman. With me is Andy Cleff, my brother in love.
Currently Philadelphian, so that's perfect. The city of brotherly love.
I did not do that on purpose. I would love
Yes,
to tell you
you
I'm
did.
not smart. I would love to tell you I'm not smart. We are doing Principle 8. Agile processes promote sustainable development. The sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. Now, we were talking, Andy, before we started recording. This is probably one of the most misquoted and misunderstood of the principles, yes?
Yeah, there's so many bad metaphors out there and misunderstandings. It's going to be fun to unpack this one with you, Chris.
Okay, let's start with some of the history behind this principle. You were telling me that during our manifesto series that several of the 17 signees contributed little bits and pieces to kind of this. So I guess for listeners, this will be kind of a good history lesson. Where did this principle come from, Andy?
My understanding is that Kent Beck, in his first edition of Extreme Programming, 1999, we refer to it XP, suggested that developers or the team work no more than 40 hours a week. And in the rare instances where overtime was necessary, never do that a second week in a row. So I think Kent gets the Foundation Award for coming up with the original concept of a sustainable pace. Bob Martin, Uncle Bob, looked at it and he added to it a concept of the 8-hour burn, meaning you could go flat out for 8 hours and do that sort of intensive energy aspect and pulled it away a little bit from it's a whole week, don't worry about it. Because shit, you could do 40 hours in 2 days.
Right.
Then Ron Jeffries came along, and I think he added the concept of sustainable pace to combine both Uncle Bob's and Kent's. It's not about a 40-hour work week. It's not about an 8-hour day. It is a sustainable pace. And then Alistair came along and said, sustainable pace. That's about two things. It's about maintaining project effectiveness and a social responsibility to the team. An early exploration into the concept that we call today work-life balance.
Mm-hmm. Kind of summarizing all of those different pieces is, do we have the ability to press ourselves more intensely? Most of the time, yes, right? So while we have the ability to press and push, I always use the metaphor of pegging the RPMs on a car, right? While we have the ability to put the pedal to the metal, get it to its top speed, right? You wouldn't want to do it over a long period of time.
And that's one of the biggest misconceptions that I see. When someone new to this mindset looks at this and goes, sustainable pace, what, take it easy, go slow? No, that's not what this means. Just as you described, sometimes you put the pedal to the metal. You expend energy really vigorously to get through something. But as you also said, you let the pedal up. And so you regain capability by taking time to rest. And I think it's a combo of those two.
This is where I guess where I kind of get hung up a little bit is because there's the first sentence we can totally get behind that, right? Sustainable development. There's a lot of pieces of that. There's a technical aspect to sustainable development that's definitely part of XP. There's a people aspect to it, which is kind of what you were referring to with that Alistair kind of brought in about work-life balance, right? Sustainable work. But this, like the first part of the next sentence, the sponsors, developers, and users. What does that mean? Like, I get the whole sponsors. There's an aspect that the sponsor plays in a constant pace indefinitely. Developers have a role of a constant pace indefinitely. But what is the user? How does the user contribute to a constant pace indefinitely? Have you ever thought about that?
No, I haven't. You caught me off guard. So the word's always been there for 15, 16 years. I would say off the cuff that users must continue to use what we deliver. And we can't take them out of the equation. Constant pace indefinitely. We can quibble in a bit about what we mean by constant pace. Well, let's not wait a bit. For me, it maintain a stable and predictable pace.
Oh, you hit a trigger word for me just now. My body just convulsed when you said predictable.
I don't know if it's constant, but anyway, the idea behind all of what we do with this mindset, with these principles and value, is to enable continuous delivery of value to our users. And if our users aren't in the game but once every 18 months,
right,
what's the point? It's not sustainable development.
Our fellow board member and friend Colleen, she talks about end-to-end Kanban being, can you use metrics around work that's already in production to inform the work that's entering the Kanban board on the left-hand side, right? Can we allow our users to inform our work and make decisions based upon not just what the sponsors think, not just what the developers think, but can we all work together to have a steady flow? That's the word that I use when I think of constant pace indefinitely. I think of steady, and we joked earlier about like marathon, sprint, whatever kind of a thing. I don't care whatever. Like maybe it's not even a race, right? Maybe the idea of race means that you can win at something, right? Like this is not this principle is not about a competition. It's really just about, can we steadily keep things flowing?
I'll take your improvement on my stable and predictable and will approve your pull request to include steady. Maintain a steady pace indefinitely. And go back again to these metaphors that people keep throwing at us that are horrible. Yeah, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Well, in a sense, a marathon ends after what, 24.6, 26.4? You take a break. So you cannot continue to run the pace of a marathon indefinitely. You exhaust yourself, you exhaust your team members, which I think is where Kent and Bob and all these people are coming from is, 40 hours a week, 8 hours a day, work-life balance. These are constraints that we want to put in to ensure that we are not exhausting ourselves. Ourselves being the sponsors, the developers, the users. If we're shipping every 11 seconds and expecting user feedback, well, I guess we can accomplish that, but it is somewhat automated. It is not focus groups every 11 seconds, but it's data coming into our system.
Yeah, the lean principle of optimizing the whole is what comes to mind when I think of this, right? So like if sponsors, developers, users, if we're all working together, we are optimizing the whole of our flow, right? We have done our kind of mapping of our workflow, and we've seen the pain points and we've identified them all. Like, can we optimize the whole thing to promote sustainable development? And development can also be, we can take development out and just sustainable work, right? Because again, not everybody may be developing, but can these processes that we set up, right? Can we get rid of all the metaphor words? I was trying to Google before we started recording, like when the term sprint came up. I know that the first white paper on Scrum was out before the manifesto was written. So I know the idea of a sprint has been out for a very, very long time. And in fact, the Scrum Guide still uses the word sprint, despite, I've got 3 certifications. I hate that word, but so it still exists, right? There's still this idea of we've got to get going. We've got to speed up. We've got to get, crank more and more out, right? Because we need you're not the only one that uses the word predictable, right? We've got to know, when is my stuff going to get done? When can this new work item be worked on, right? We're always trying to figure out, and I think this principle is kind of been bastardized to sort of encourage this to a degree, right?
Right. And it comes back to sustainable and what happens if we don't do a sustainable. I think we need also an emphasis on steady pace and indefinitely. I was talking to somebody about game theory the other day, finite games versus infinite games. And this might be a topic fun for a podcast. But the idea of a finite game is there's a winner and a loser, and it's over when it's over. It's a marathon or it's a sprint. Somebody crosses the finish line, they're first place. No one else is in first place. That's a finite game. What we're playing in most of our development, whether it's software, hardware, is an infinite game. We want to stay in business infinitely, and we can't do that if we don't have a sustainable pace.
One of the first phrases I ever learned in leadership was, "There's always another release." Right? You can always have another release. You don't have to squeeze everything in. There's always another release, kind of a thing, or another iteration.
Another train leaving the station. You mentioned the concept of technical development. So there's a danger here that I see where there is always another release. Sometimes when you're forced to go redline, you will take shortcuts. Sometimes if you are forced into that second week of overtime, you don't realize your cognitive abilities have seriously dropped. And this is one of the things, I think it was Martin Fowler borrowed the financial metaphor of debt and brought it into our craft of software development and said, you are creating technical debt in your software. And I wonder if this concept of, there's another release next week, there's another release in a month, let's take a shortcut now because we got to maintain this incredible pace, leads to the creation of debt over time.
That points to this idea of what do I get for my effort? Whether it be, if we're trying to, again, something predictable, right, or measurable. Okay, you're speaking this idea of trade-offs, right? So, well, we want this feature, we want this thing, we want this widget out into the world, and we're willing to ship with a couple of bugs in order to get this thing out into the world. And I think on its face, that's not necessarily a mortal sin, so to speak, but this idea of, well, what are we willing to trade off in order to do so? I coach a lot of the business side of companies now because we're strangely enough, in the Agile community, we've gotten better at the transactional kind of framework coaching, right? Like we'll do the stand up and we'll do the retro and the planning thing, and we can do the delivery thing, right? But like, what does it truly mean for the business side to have agility? And the concept of a trade-off is so foreign to them because they're like, we have a thing, we need a thing, let's ship the thing. And we say, okay, well, what quality would you like to see of that? How much rework do you want to get done, right? Is it just because you told someone that by the end of 2017 we'd have this thing done? And they're like, well, we'll just MVP it, right? Let's just do like something small. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean it's quality work? Does it mean does it mean that the UI is wireframed? Does it mean that, what do you mean when you say prototype, right? How much of the data do you need? Does it need to be production? Does it need to be tests? Like, what do we, and they don't, once you get into the weeds of that, that's when they get bogged down and they go, oh, see, this is why we don't do Agile, right?
And you can say, oh, so at the end of 17, we want to deliver X. Now, you realize if we maintain that pace and we deliver the first quarter of 2018, you won't be able to do jack shit because we will have accumulated so much debt that no one would be willing to touch any piece of the code because it's going to break. And then your whole 2018 feature roadmap is out the window. We can come back to this principle to say,
right,
this is not a steady pace. This is not sustainable work. We need to build in time to do any number of things that, from a pure sponsor point of view, seems like non-value adding in the short term, things that are almost second nature to a mature team, CI, CD, automated testing, automating all the things. And the sponsor, the business, the users, they don't necessarily see that stuff. It's not a feature they can touch, play with, use, but it does add it's part of the process that the whole ecosystem needs to respect to maintain sustainability and steady pace indefinitely. I don't know how we make that visible. I don't know how we make that valuable.
You're referring to all the illities. Quite simply, we could just say, well, make everybody get into the room and have a conversation about this equally. That's harder sometimes than it seems, or more trouble than it's worth to some organizations. And they say, just go deal with it, right? Just tell me what this means. You can use patent story mapping technique to show all the things that need to get done. The more visible you make everything, right? And force everybody to look at each other eye to eye and say, what do you mean, Mr. Architect, that we need to budget 20% of our backlog for things like security and performance and sustainability and reliability and things of that nature? What do you mean we have to spend the first 2 iterations building a CD pipeline that's got all the gimmicks and tricks and stuff? What do you mean we need to do all that? Why can't I have X? That's what so often when I'm sitting down with leadership. In fact, the program I just got finished coaching, they said we really expected to see more in the first. Like we thought we were going to get going much faster than it took much longer to get started than we thought. And I said, well, why do you feel like it took longer? And they thought, well, we thought that, you did a bunch of interviews and you sat down and talked with us and we kind of came up with an experiment. We just figured like, okay, we'll just sit down and start doing it. And then in 2-3 weeks, it'll just be working, right? Like, what do you mean we can't get going faster? Well, okay, I should have probably sat everybody down. I said, this is what it looks like. And we have to do that in our teams because if we don't, we're gonna be immediately behind. The project's gonna be yellow, or if we go back to the whole red, yellow, green principle, right?
Yeah, we got a podcast on that one. We can have a whole nother debate. Don't toss watermelons. That's the TLDR for that one.
If you don't force each other to look everybody in the face, visualize the work, right? Those are the processes that it says that it's speaking to here when they say promote sustainable development, right?
I agree. And one of the things I struggle with in that same sort of environment you just described is building in room for free time and relaxation, room for exploration and development that indirectly and long-term produces value for the business. What are some of the things that you've uncovered that help in the conversation, similar to the one you just described, where your stakeholders and sponsors says, gosh, I thought you'd be a lot further than you are right now on Sprint 3, Chris. What's going on here? How do we build that long-term perspective that this is, and again, you can't go to faulty metaphors of this is a marathon. It's not. Marathon has an end.
So you mentioned this infinite game kind of principle. My ex-wife's family, they're not the competitive type. I grew up in a West Texas family where everything is a game and everything has got a winner and a loser, and there were no participation trophies when I was a kid, right? But they had this. They pulled this thing out of the closet when I first was introduced to them, and it's called the Ungame, and it was developed in the '70s by these filthy hippies that probably you and I hang out with now. And this idea is there was no start line, there was no finish line. You just kept playing until and there were questions, and maybe you'd move forward and maybe you'd move backward, but it didn't really matter where you were on the board, just where you were was the kind of card that you picked. And I thought, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Like, that sounds like the stupidest way to spend time. But in a way, that concept is the environment that we're trying to build, which is who cares how far down the roadmap we are? Like, just where we are is where we are. And what we need to do is what we need to do. Regardless of how open-minded or freewheeling hippie you are, I think that concept is lost on us as humans, especially if you're talking about the sponsors of this piece, right? They need to have their roadmap advance. They need to have their metrics improve. They need to have all these things because budget is being allocated for this work, and I'll be damned if I'm not going to make it look like we're doing good, because if we're not progressing, like, why am I making all this money, right?
Are you heading down the path of incompatibility? I mean, I was smiling for a while and it turned to a frown, because inherently, the gold owners, the sponsors, they've got a bottom line responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
They've got shareholders, board of directors, market forces, stock prices to be responsible for, and something to hit. They aren't looking at infinity. They're looking at the end of the quarter.
I will say this. There are some companies that are truly starting to see the value in breaking things into smaller chunks, right? So like companies are starting to take, instead of a yearly budget and these yearly planning conferences that they do, they're starting to break them up into quarterly budget reviews or monthly budget reviews. Like those are the crazy out companies of like, okay, this, next month's budget, we have, these number of teams allocated towards these strategic objectives, kind of a thing. I mean, that's one of the things that I actually appreciate about Scaled Agile. What they do is they've managed to take the work and they've managed to quantify it into this fixed, firm, flexible stage of let's look at the next quarter. How can we fund the right epics and teams to get the work done, right? Well, that's scary to so many people because they're like, well, I have to use all my budget or I won't get that budget next month, or I won't get it for the next year. Leadership is not motivated by tech debt. Leadership is not motivated by a sustainable, but to them, sustainable means I am using all the funds being allocated to me. I'm using, and this is the dreaded R word, all my resources are being used appropriately. And as a result, I'm adding to the bottom line and I'm achieving the goals of everything. None of that is represented in this principle a single bit, because that's them in their own little ivory tower, so to speak, right? This principle says those sponsors come down from Olympus and have a conversation with developers and users, and they say, how do we make sure that we are optimized for the work that you all want to get done? Let's visualize it. Let's talk together. Heck, why can't we all be in the same room together? Hey, users, here's the business people. Hey, developers, here's the stuff that they're building for you. Like, that's a crazy concept. I feel like we've been futzing around this, just kind of venting for a while. Is this principle worded well? Do you feel like that the message is lost and we need to improve it? Is it just not being? Are we not teaching the principle well? Like where do you see the failure with this principle being used effectively in the market today?
Some of the gaps we've talked about, and I'll recap them as we read through it one more time. Agile processes promote sustainable development. Okay, that's pretty clear. The sponsors, there's a gap there. Developers, I think, get it. It's obvious what happens when we hit burnout creatively or in life. Users, big question there we haven't really talked about in the Agile community at length in the context of this principle, should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. And I love your approach of, no, it's not stable. Sometimes you're redlining, but you're backing off. Predictable, yeah, the sponsors and the users need some predictability. And maybe it's encapsulated better in a steady pace. The important part is sustainable and indefinite, which brings it into this infinite game. And there's this collision, I think, with users' expectations as well as our sponsors' expectations. The culture that our sponsors are in, that they have shareholders, stakeholders, they have metrics they need to hit. And that's where some of the tension comes from. I think the principle for me holds. It's strong. It fits pretty well with all the other ones that we try to reflect on every day when we hit some of these tensions. And it brings to light more conversations that we have to have with our sponsors, mostly about what it means to be sustainable and to operate at a steady pace indefinitely without consequences. I love your analogy of taking a high performance machine / team and redlining it, but you can't hold it there for long. You will explode. You will seize a piston. You will lose team members. You will build technical debt. You'll piss off your users, and suddenly your indefinite becomes a definite.
Man, you hit something. There was so much of what you said that was genius. I would say that if there was a word that I felt that was missing, I think in the second sentence, I feel like what we've been describing, and this just kind of came to me, so I'm not sure if this makes sense or not, but I feel like the word together should be used, right? The sponsors, developers, and users together should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely, right? Like, can we all have a conversation to say, what does sustainable sound like to you? What is sustainable development? Okay, is it a technical piece? Is it a lean Kanban method of business requests? What does constant pace? What does indefinite sound like? When do we inspect and adapt in this piece? Which we get to later on, right? So if we're doing all these things, if we're doing all these principles, and then stopping at the end with number 12 and inspecting and adapting, what does it look like? Is this sustainable? Is what we're doing sustainable? Have we broken anything? Are we taxing? Maybe the team, you mentioned a high performing team. Maybe the developers are moving too fast to keep up with sponsors' requests. Colleen tells a story of that in one of her conference talks about the teams got so optimized that business couldn't keep up with the needs to feed them work, right? Maybe the users are fine with the work they have. Maybe the users are fine with just maybe stabilizing the site a little bit. They don't like 404s or when the load time is increased because of all this extra bloat we've got added in here. Maybe we should slim down maybe there's features that they're not using we could take out and unify the code base a little bit. Maybe developers are taxed too much and sponsors need to slow down. Like all of those pushes and pulls and sliders that we use have to be together in the same room. Otherwise it's not going to be optimized.
I think that's perfect. And it reminds me of a bias that I fall into is I look at principles occasionally in isolation. If you pull them back, and your word together reminds me to pull them back and look at all 12 as a holistic unit, and you come back to number 4, daily business collaboration. Business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. And it reinforces this principle. When the developers are saying, this is not sustainable, you realize this is the 4th week we've done 80 hours.
Number 6, where you have to have face-to-face conversation, right? So maybe if sponsors, develop, and users are having face-to-face conversation together, maybe we can understand that, And of course, you move a couple principles down there, and then you've got some simplicity, right? How can we take it our constant pace and make it simple, maximize the amount of work not done, right? How do we do that?
All that adds together. The face-to-face is a beautiful piece, and thanks for bringing that back in. So if the developers have worked all night and they drag their tired butts in at 10:30, bleary-eyed and with rings around their eyes, the business owners can see it. Similarly, when the business people show up stressed to the max because they're getting hammered by the hierarchy that says you're not meeting your numbers this month, you see that stress expose. So they all add together. They don't work in isolation.
It's a good chat.
Oh, Horse Cows Challenge, man. Reword the verse. 8 maids a milking. Don't stall for time with laughter.
8 team members burnt out.
8 team members vigorously coding. Oh my God.
That's it. I hate Jay.
I hate Jay too, but I love him as well. Damn, him and his challenges. We'll throw this back to Jay. Jay, you reword it, please.
We love you. We love you and we hate you. He's Andy Cleff. I'm Chris Merman. Thanks for joining us.